Battlefield Earth, a saga of the year 3000. The Cyclones, approximately 9 feet tall, densely muscular, with a purple furry coating. Part 1, Chapter 1. Man, said Turl, is an endangered species. The hairy paws of the Chamco brothers hung suspended above the broad keys of the laser bash game. The cliffs of Char's eyebrows drew down over his yellow orbs as he looked up in mystery. Even the steward, who had been padding quietly about picking up her saucepans, lumbered to a halt and stared. Turl could not have produced a more profound effect than had he thrown a meat girl naked into the middle of the room. The clear dome of the Intergalactic Mining Company Employee Recreation Hall shone black around and above them, silvered at its crossbars by the pale glow of the Earth's single moon, half full on this late summer night. Turl lifted his large amber eyes from the tomb and rested minutely in his massive claws, and looked around the room. He was suddenly aware of the effect he had produced. It had amused him. Anything to relieve the humdrum monotony of a 10-year duty tour in this God's abandoned mining camp, way out here on the edge of a minor galaxy. In an even more professional voice, already deep and roaring enough, Turl repeated his thought. Man is an endangered species. Char glowered at him. What in the name of diseased crap are you reading? Turl did not much care for his tone. After all, Char was simply one of several mine managers, but Turl was chief of mine site security. I didn't read it. I thought it. You must have got it from somewhere. What is that book? Turl held it up so Char could see. It said, General Report of the General Mining Sites, Volume 250, 369. Like all such books, it was huge, but printed on material that made it almost weightless, particularly in a low-gravity planet such as Earth. A triumph of design and a manufacture that did not cut heavily into the payloads of freighters. Rawr, cried Kerr in disgust. That must be 300 Earth years old. If you ought to prowl around in books, I got an up-to-date General Board of Directors report that says we're 35 freighters behind in bauxite deliveries. The Chamco brothers looked at each other, at their game to see where they had gotten to in shooting down the live mayflies in the airbox. But Turl's next words distracted them again. Today, he said, brushing Charles' push for work aside, I got a sighting report from a recon drone that recorded only 35 men in that valley near the peak. Pearl waved his paw westward toward the towering mountain range, silhouetted by the moon. So, said Char. So I dug up the books out of curiosity. There used to be hundreds in that valley, and furthermore, continued Turl with his professional ways of coming back, there used to be thousands and thousands of them on this planet. You can't believe all you read, said Char heavily. On my last duty tour, it was Arcturus 4. This book, said Turl, lifting it impressively, was compiled by the Culture and Ethnology Department of Intergalactic Mining Company. The larger Chamco brother batted his eyebrows. I didn't know he had one. Char sniffed. It was disbanded more than a century ago. Useless waste of money, yapping around about ecological impacts and junk like that. He shifted his bulk around to Tur. Is this some kind of scheme to explain a non-scheduled vacation? You're going to get your butt in a bind? I can see it. A pile of requisitions this high for breathe gas tanks and scoutcraft. You won't get any of my workers. Turn off the juice, said Turl. I only said that, man. I know what you said. But you got your appointment because you are clever. That's right, clever. Not intelligent. Clever. And I can see right through an excuse to go on a hunting expedition. What Cyclo in his right skull would bother with those things? The smaller Chamco brother grinned. I get tired of just dig, ship. Hunting might be fun. I didn't think anybody did it before Char turned on him like a tank zeroing on its prey. Fun hunting those things? You ever see one? He lurched to his feet and the floor creaked under his bulk. He put his jaw just above his belt They only come up to here. They got hardly any hair on them except on their heads. They're a dirty white colour like a slug. They're so brittle they break up when you try to put them in a pouch. He snarled in disgust and picked up a saucepan of cabango. They're so weak they couldn't even pick this up without straining their guts. And they're not good eating. He tossed off the cabango and made an earthquake shudder. Whoa, you ever see one? Said the biggest younger brother. Char sat down. The drone rumbled. And he handed the empty saucepan to the steward. No, he said. Not alive. I've seen some bones in the shafts, and I heard stuff. There were thousands of them once, said Turl, ignoring the mine manager. Thousands, all over the place. Char belched. Shouldn't wonder they die off. They breathe this oxygen, nitrogen, air stuff. It's deadly. I got a crack in my face mask yesterday, said the smaller Shanko brother. For about 30 seconds, I thought I wasn't going to make it. Bright lights bursting inside your skull. Deadly stuff. I really look forward to getting back home where you can walk around without a suit or a mask, where the gravity gives you something to push against, where everything is a beautiful purple, and there's not one bit of this green stuff. My papa used to tell me that if I wasn't a good little cyclone, and if I didn't say sir, sir, sir to the right people, I'd wind up at the butt end of nowhere like this. He was right. I did. It's your shot, brother. Char sat back and eyed Turl. You ain't really going hunting for a man, are you? Turl looked at his book. He inserted one of his talons deep inside to keep his place, and then he thumped the volume against his knee. I think you're wrong. There was something to these creatures. Before we came along, it says here, they had towns on every continent. They had flying machines and boats. They even appear to have fired off stuff into space. How do you know that wasn't some other race? How do you know it wasn't some lost colony of cyclos? No, it wasn't that, said Turl. Cyclos can't breathe this air. It was man all right. Just like the cultural guys researched. And writes in our own histories. You know how it says we got here? Bah, said Charles. Man apparently sent out some kind of probe that gave full directions to the place, had pictures of man on it and everything. It got picked up by this cyclo-recon, and you know what? Puffers, said Charles. The probe and these pictures were on a metal that was rare everywhere and worth a clanking fortune. An intergalactic paid the silo governors 60 trillion galactic credits for the directions and the concession. One gas barrage, and we were in business. Fairy tales, said Char. Every planet I ever helped guts has some bussin' crap story like that. Every one. He yawned his face into a huge cavern. All that was hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago. You even notice that the public relations department always puts their fairy tales so far back, nobody can ever check them. I'm going to go out and catch one of them things, said Turl. Not that any of my crews or equipment you ain't, said Char. Turl heaved his mammoth bulk off the seat and crossed the creaking floor to the berthing hatch. You're as crazy as a nebula of crap, said Char. The two Chamco brothers got back into the game and intently laser blasted the entrapped mayflies into smoky puffs one by one. Char looked at the empty door. The security chief knew no psycho could go up into those mountains. Turl was crazy. There was deadly uranium up there. But Turl, rumbling along the hallway to his room, did not consider himself crazy. He was being very clever as always. He had started the rumor, so no questions would get out of hand when he began to put into motion the personal plans that would make him wealthy and powerful and, almost as important, dig him out of this accursed planet. The man-things were the perfect answer. All he needed was just one, and then he could get the others. His campaign had begun. Very well, he thought. Very well. He went to sleep gloating over how clever he was. It was a good day for a funeral, only it seemed there wasn't going to be one. Dark, stormy clouds were creeping in from the west, shredded by the snow-speckled peaks, leaving only a few patches of blue sky showing. Johnny Goodboy Tyler stood beside his horse at the upper end of the wide meadow, and looked with discontent upon the sprawled and decaying village. His father was dead, and he ought to be properly buried. He hadn't died of the red blotches, and there was no question of someone else catching it. His bones had just crumbled away, so there was no excuse not to properly bury him. Yet there was no sign of anyone doing so. Johnny had gotten up in the dark dawn, determined to choke down his grief and go about his correct business. He had yelled up Windsplitter, the fastest of his several horses, put a cowhide rope on his nose, and gone down through the dangerous defiles to the lower plain, and with a lot of hard riding and herding, pushed 5 wild cattle back up to the mountain meadow. He had then bashed out the brains of the fattest of them, and ordered his Aunt Ellen to push the barbecue fire together and get meat cooking. Aunt Ellen hadn't cared for the orders. She had broken her sharpest rock, she said. She couldn't skin and cut the meat, and certain men hadn't dragged in any firewood lately. Johnny Goodboy had stood very tall and looked at her. Among people who were average height, Johnny Goodboy stood half a head taller, a muscular 6 feet shining with bronze health of his 20 years. Gay boy! He had just stood there, wind tangling his corn yellow hair and beard, looking at her with ice blue eyes. And Aunt Ellen had gone and found some wood, and had put a very good stone to work, even though it was a dull one. He could see her now down there, below him, wrapped in the smoke of slow-roasting meat, busy. There ought to be more activity in the village, Johnny thought. The last big funeral he had seen was when he was about 5 years old, when Smith, the mayor, had died. There had been songs and preaching and a feast, and it had ended with a dance by moonlight. Mayor Smith had been put in a hole in the ground, and the dirt filled in over him. And while the 2 cross sticks of the marker were long since gone, it had been a proper, respectful funeral. More recently they had just dumped the dead in the Black Rock Gulch below the water pool, and let the coyotes clean them up. Burp. Well, that wasn't the way you went about it, Johnny told himself. Not with his father, anyway. He spun on his heel and with one motion went aboard Windsplitter. The thump of his hard, bare heel sent the horse down toward the courthouse. He passed by the decayed ruins of the cabins on the outskirts. Every time they caved in further, for every year. For a long time, anybody needing a building log hadn't bothered to cut trees. They had just stripped handy existing structures. But the logs in these cabins were so eaten up and rotted now, they hardly even served as firewood. Windsplitter picked his way down the weed-grown track, walking watchfully to avoid stepping on ancient and newly discarded food bones and trash. He twitched his ear toward a distant wolf howl from up the mountain glen. The smell of new blood and the meat smoke must be pulling the wolves down, thought Johnny, and he hefted his kill club from where it dangled by a thong into his palm. He'd lately seen a wolf right down into the cabins, prowling around for bones, or maybe even a puppy or a child. Even a decade ago it wouldn't have happened, but every year there were fewer and fewer people. Legends said that there had been 1,000 in the valley, but Johnny thought that was probably just an exaggeration. There was plenty of food. The wide plains below the peaks were overrun with wild cattle, wild pigs, and bands of horses. The ranges above were alive with wild deer and goats, where even an unskilled hunter had no trouble getting food. There was plenty of water due to the melting snows and streams, and the little patches of vegetables would thrive if anyone planted them and tended them. No, it wasn't food. It was something else. Animals reproduced, it seemed, but man did not. At least not to any extent. The death rate and the birth rate were unbalanced, with death the winner. Even when children were born, they sometimes had only one eye, or one lung, or one hand, and had to be left out in the icy night. Monsters were unwanted things. All life was overpowered by a fear of monsters. Maybe it was this valley. When he was 7, he had asked his father about it. Maybe people can't live in this place, he had said. His father looked at him warily. There were people in some other valleys, according to the legends, but they're all gone. But there are still some of us left. He had not been convinced. Johnny had said, there are all these plains down there, and they're full of animals. Why don't we go and live there? Johnny had always been a bit of a trial. Too smart, the elders had said. Always stirring things up, questions. And did he believe what he was told? Even by older men who knew a lot better? No, not Johnny Goodboy Tyler. But his father had not brought any of this up. He had just said warily, there's no timber down there to build cabins. This hadn't explained anything. So Johnny had said, I bet I could find something down there to build a cabin with. His father had knelt down, patient for once, and said, you're a good boy, Johnny, and your mother and I love you very much. But nobody could build anything that would keep out the monsters. Monsters. All his life, Johnny had been hearing about the monsters. He'd never seen one, but he held his peace. The oldsters believed in monsters, so they believed in monsters. But thinking of his father brought an unwelcome wetness to his eyes, and he was almost unseated as his horse reared. A string of foot-long mountain rats had rushed headlong from the cabin and hit Winspletter's legs. That's what you get for dreaming, Johnny snapped to himself. He put Winspletter's 4 hooves back down on the path and drummed him forward the last few yards to the courthouse. Chrissy was standing there, her leg being hugged, as always, by her younger sister. Johnny Goodboy ignored her and looked at the courthouse. The old building was the only one to have a stone foundation and stone floor. Somebody had said it was 1,000 years old, and though Johnny didn't believe it, the place sure looked it. Even its 17th roof was as sway-backed as an overpacked horse. There wasn't a log in the upper structure that wasn't gaping with wormholes. The windows were mainly caved in like eyeholes of a rotted skull. The stone walkway close to it was worn half a foot deep by the bare, horny feet of scores of generations of villagers coming here to be tried and punished in the olden days when somebody had cared. In his lifetime, Johnny had never seen a trial, or a town meeting for that matter. Parson Stafford is inside, said Chrissy. She was a slight girl, very pretty, about 18. She had large black eyes, in strange contrast to her corn silk hair. I'm noticing a common theme of slim, white blonde. She had wrapped around herself a doeskin really tight, and it showed her breasts and a lot of bare leg. Her little sister, I don't remember it showing her that much breast. Hang on. Her little sister, Patty, a budding, what got that expression, of the older girl, looked bright-eyed and interested. Is it going to be a real funeral, Johnny? Johnny didn't answer. He slid off Winspletter in a graceful single motion. He handed the lead rope to Patty, who ecstatically uncoiled herself from Chrissy's leg and snatched at it. At 7, Patty had no parents and little enough of a home, and her son rose and set upon Johnny's proud orders. Is it going to be meat and a burying in a hole in the ground and everything? Demanded Patty. Johnny started through the courthouse door, paying no heed to the hand Chrissy tried to touch him. Parson Stafford lay sprawled on a mound of dirty grass, mouth open in loud snores, flies buzzing around. Johnny stirred him with his foot. Parson Stafford had seen better days. Once he had been fat and inclined to pomposity, but that was before he had begun to chew the loco weed. To ease his toothaches, he said. He was gaunt now, dried up and nearly toothless. Seamed with inlaid grime, some wads of weed lay on the stones beside his mouldy bed. As the toe prodded him again, Stafford opened his eyes and rubbed some of the scum out of them in alarm. Then he saw it was just Johnny Goodboy Tyler, and he fell back without interest. Get up, said Johnny. That's this generation, muttered the parson. No respect for their elders, rushing off to the bushes, fornicating, grabbing the best pieces of meat. Get up, said Johnny. You are going to give a funeral. A funeral? moaned Stafford. With meat and sermons and dancing. Who is dead? You know quite well who's dead. You were there at the end. Oh, yes, your father. A good man. Yes, a good man. Well, maybe he was your father. Johnny looked suddenly a little dangerous. He was standing there at ease, but he was wearing the skin of a puma that he himself had slain, and he had his kill club on a wrist thong. The club seemed to jump of its own volition into his palm. Parson Stafford abruptly sat up. Now, don't take it wrong, Johnny. It's just that things got a little bit mixed up in the olden days. You know, your mother had 3 husbands, one time and another, and there being no real ceremonies these days. You had better get up, said Johnny. Stafford clawed for the corner of an ancient scarred bench and pulled himself upright. He began to tie the deerskin he usually wore, and obviously had worn far too long. Using a frayed woven grass rope, my memory isn't so good these days, tying the rope. One time I could remember all kinds of things, legends, marriages, ceremonies, hunt blessings, even family quarrels. He was looking around for some fresh loco-weed. When the sun is straight up, said Johnny, you're going to call the whole village together at the old graveyard, and who's going to dig the hole? There has to be a hole, you know, for a proper funeral. I'll dig the hole, said Johnny. Stafford had found some fresh loco-weed and began to gum it. He looked relieved. Well, I'm glad the town doesn't have to dig the hole. Horns, but this stuff is green. You said meat. Who is going to kill and cook it? That is all taken care of. Stafford nodded and then abruptly saw more work ahead. He was going to assemble the people. I'll ask Patty to get them. Stafford looked at him reproachfully. Then it's nothing for me to do until straight up. Why did you wake me? He threw himself back down upon the dirty grass and sourly watched Johnny walk out of the ancient room. Johnny Goodboy sat with his knees to his chest, his arms wrapped around them, staring into the remains of the dance fire. Chrissy lay on her stomach beside him, idly shredding the seeds from a large sunflower between her very white teeth. She looked up at Johnny from time to time, a little puzzled, but not unduly so. She had never seen him cry before. Even as a little boy, she knew he had loved his father, but Johnny was usually so tall and grand, even cold. Could it be that under that good-looking, almost pretty face, he felt emotions for her too? It was something to speculate about. She knew very well how she felt about Johnny. If anything happened to Johnny, she would throw herself off the cliff, where they sometimes herded wild cattle to their death. An easy way to kill them. Life without Johnny Goodboy would not be worth living. It would be completely unbearable. Maybe Johnny did care about her. The tears showed something. Patty had no such troubles. She was not only stuffed herself with roast meat, she had also stuffed herself with the wild strawberries that they had been served up by the heap. And then during the dancing she had run and run and run with 2 or 3 little boys, and then come back to eat some more. She was sleeping so heavily she looked like a mound of rags. Johnny blamed himself. He had tried to tell his father, not just when he was 7, but many times thereafter, that something was wrong with this place. Places were not all the same. Johnny was sure of it. Why did the pigs and horses and cattle in the plains have little pigs and horses and cattle so numerously and so continuously? Yes, and why were there more and more wolves and coyotes and pumas and birds up in the higher ranges, and fewer men? The villagers had been quite happy with the funeral, especially since Johnny and a couple of others had done most of the work. Johnny had not been happy with it at all. It wasn't good enough. They had gathered at sun straight up on the knoll above the village, where some said the graveyard had been. The markers were all gone. Maybe it had been a graveyard. When Johnny had toiled naked so as not to stain his puma skin cloak and doe breeches in the morning sun, he had dug into something that might have been an old grave. At least there was a bone in it that could have been human. The villagers had come slouching around, and there had been a wait while Patty tore back to the courthouse and awakened Parson Stafford again. Only 25 of them had assembled. The others had said they were too tired and asked for any food to be brought back to them. Then there had been an argument about the shape of the grave hole. Johnny had dug it oblong, so the body could lie level. But when Stafford arrived, he said, "It should be straight up and down. That graves were dug straight up and down because you could get more bodies into a graveyard that way." When Johnny had pointed out that there weren't any burials these days, and that there was plenty of room, Stafford told him off in front of everybody. "You're too smart," Stafford rasped at him. "When we had even half a council, they used to remark on it all the time. Every few council meetings, some prank of yours would come up. You'd ridden to the high ridge and killed a goat. You'd gone clear up to High Peak and gotten lost in a blizzard and found your way back. You said, by following the down slope to the ground. Too smart. Who else trained 6 horses? Everybody knows graves should be straight up and down." But they had buried his father laying flat anyway, because nobody else wanted to do more digging, and the sun was now past straight up, and it was starting to get hot. Johnny hadn't dared suggest what he really wanted to do. There would have been a riot. He had wanted to put his father in the cave of the ancient gods, far up at the top of the dark canyon, a savage cleft in the side of the tallest peak. When he was 12, he had strayed up there, more trying out some ponies than going anywhere. But the way up the canyon had been very flat and inviting. He had gone for miles and miles and miles, and then he had abruptly halted by some giant vertical doors. They were of some kind of metal, heavily corroded. One couldn't see them from above or even from the canyon rims. They were absolutely huge, and they went up and up. He had gotten off his pony and climbed over the rubble in front of them and simply stared. He had walked all around in circles and then come back and stared some more. After a while he had gotten brave and had walked up to them, but push as he might, he couldn't open them. Then he had found a latch-like bar and had pried it off, and it fell, just missing his foot, rusted but very, very heavy. He had braced his shoulder against one door, sure that it was a door, and pushed and pushed. But his 12-year-old shoulder and weight just hadn't had much effect upon it. Then he had taken the fallen bar and begun to pry it into the slight crack, and after a few minutes he had gotten a purchase of it. There had been a horrible groaning sound that had almost stood his hair straight up, and he dropped the bar and ran for the pony. Once he had mounted, his fright ebbed just a little bit. Maybe it was just a sound caused by the rusted hinges. Maybe it wasn't a monster. He had gone back and worked some more with the bar, and sure enough, it was just the door groaning on the pins that still held it. An awful smell had come out of the cracked opening. The smell itself had made him afraid. A little light had been let in, and he peeked inside. A long flight of steps led down, remarkably even steps, and they would have been very neat, except the steps were covered by skeletons, tumbled every which way, skeletons in strips of clothing like he had never seen before. Bits of metal shone brightly in the dark, and fallen amongst the bones. He ran away again, but this time not as far as a pony. He had suddenly realized he would need proof. Bracing his nerve to a pitch he had never or rarely seldom before achieved, he went back and gingerly stepped inside and picked up one of the bits of metal. It had a pretty design, a bird with flying wings holding arrows in its claws, quite bright. His heart almost stopped when the skull he had removed it from tipped sideways and went to powder before his very gaze, as though it was approaching him with its gaping eyes for his robbery, and then expired. The pony had been in a white coat lather when he pulled up to the village. For 2 whole days he had said nothing, wondering how best to ask his questions. Previous experience in asking questions had made him cautious. Mayor Duncan was still alive at that time. Johnny had sat quietly beside him until the big man was properly stuffed with venison and quiet, except for a few belches. "That big tomb," said Johnny abruptly. "That big what?" "The place up in the dark canyon where they used to put the dead people." "What place?" Johnny had taken out the bright bird badge and shown it to Mayor Duncan. Duncan had looked at it, twisting his head this way and that, twisting the badge this way and that. Parson Stafford, brighter in those days, had reached across the fire in a sudden swoop and grabbed the badge. The ensuing interrogation had not been pleasant, about young boys who went to places that were forbidden and got everyone in trouble, and didn't listen at conferences where they had to learn the legends and were too smart anyway. Mayor Duncan, however, had himself been curious and finally pinned Parson Stafford into recounting an applicable legend. "A tomb of the old gods," the parson had finally said. "Nobody has been there in living memory. Small boys do not count. But it was said to exist by my great-grandfather when he was still alive, and he lived a long time. The gods used to come into these mountains, and they buried the great men in huge caverns. When the lightning flashed on High Peak, it was because the gods had come to bury a great man from over the water. Once there were thousands and thousands living in big villages 100 times the size of this one. These villages were to the east, and it is said there is the remains of one straight east where thousands lived, and that place was flat except for some hills. And when a great man died there, the gods would have brought him here to the tomb of the gods." Parson Stafford had shaken the badge. This was placed on the foreheads of the great, where they were laid to rest in the great tomb of the gods. And that's what it is. And the ancient law says that nobody is supposed to go there, and everybody had better stay away from there forever, especially little boys. And he had put the badge in his pouch, and that was the last Johnny had ever seen of it. After all, Stafford was a holy man, and in charge of holy things. Nevertheless, Johnny thought his father should have been buried in the tomb of the gods. Johnny had never been back there, and he only thought of it when he saw lightning hit High Peak. But he wished he had buried his father there. "Are you worried?" said Chrissy. Johnny looked down at her. His riviere broken, the dying fire wove a reddish sheen into her hair and sparkled in the dark of her eyes. "It's my fault," said Johnny. Chrissy smiled and shook her head. "Nothing could ever be Johnny's fault." "Yes, it is," said Johnny. "There's something wrong with this place. My father's bones, in the last year, they just crumbled, like that skeletons in the tomb of the gods." "Tomb of the what?" said Chrissy. Idly, if Johnny wanted to talk nonsense, it was okay with her. At least he was talking to her. God, she's smitten. "I should have buried him there. He was a great man. He taught me a lot of things. How to braid grass rope, how to wait for a puma, to crouch just before you stepped aside and hit him as he sprang. They can't turn in midair, you know. That's bollocks, by the way. And to cut hide into strips." "Johnny, you aren't guilty of anything." "It was a bad funeral." "Johnny, it's the only funeral I remember." "No, it was not a good funeral. Stafford didn't preach a funeral sermon." "He talked. I didn't listen because I was helping gather strawberries. But I know he talked. Did he say something bad?" "No, only it didn't apply." "Well, what did he say, Johnny?" "Oh, you know, all that stuff about God being angry with the people. Everybody knows that legend. I can quote it myself." "Quote it, Johnny." Johnny sniffed a little impatiently, but she was interested, and it made him feel a little bit better. "And then there came a day when God was wroth and wearied. He was of the fornicating and the pleasure dallying of the people, and he did cause a wondrous cloud to come, and everywhere it struck, the anger of God snuffed out the breath and breathing of 99 out of 100 men. And disaster lay upon the land, and plagues and epidemics rolled and smote the unholy. And when it was done, the wicked were gone, and only the holy and righteous, the true children of the Lord, remained upon the stark and bloodied field. But God even then was not sure, so he tested them. He sent monsters upon them to drive them to the hills and secret places, and lo, the monsters hunted them and made them less and less, until at last all men remaining were the only holy, the only blessed, the only sure righteous upon earth. Hey, man! Oh, that one! You say it very nicely, Johnny. It's my fault, said Johnny morosely. I should have made my father listen. There is something wrong with this place. I am certain that if he had listened and we had moved elsewhere, he would be alive today. I feel it. Where else is there? There's that whole great plain out there. Weeks of riding on it, I am sure. And they say man once lived in a big village out there. Oh no, Johnny, the monsters. I've never seen a monster. Oh, you've seen the shiny flashing things that sail overhead every few days. Oh, those. The sun and the moon sail overhead too. So do the stars, and even shooting stars. Chrissy was frightened suddenly. Johnny, you're not really going to do something? I am. With first light, I am going to ride out and see if there really is a big village in the plains. Chrissy felt her heart contract. She looked up at his determined profile. It was as though she was sinking down into the earth, although she lay in today's grave. Please, Johnny. No, I'm going. Johnny, I'll go with you. No, you stay here. He thought fast, something to deter her. I may be gone for a whole year. Water got into her sight. What will I do if you don't come back? I'll come back. Johnny, if you don't come back in a year, I'll come looking for you. Johnny frowned. He scented blackmail. Johnny, if you're leaving and you see those stars up there, when they come back to the same place next year, and if you haven't returned, I will come looking. You'd be killed out on the plains, the pigs, the wild catty. Johnny, that is what I will do. I swear it, Johnny. You think I just wander off and never return? That's what I will do, Johnny. You can go, but that is what I will do. The first dawn light was painting High Peak rose. It was going to be a beautiful day. Johnny Goodboy was completing the packing of a lead horse. Windsplitter was sidling about, biting up the grass but not really eating. He had his eye on Johnny. They were obviously going somewhere, and Windsplitter was not going to be left out. Some wisps of smoke were coming from the breakfast fire of the Jensen family nearby. They were roasting a dog. Yesterday at the funeral feast, nearly a score of dogs had gotten into an idiot fight. There had been plenty of bugs and meat as well, but the pack had gotten into a fight, and a big brindle had been killed. Looked like the Jensen family would be having meat all day long. Woof woof. Johnny was trying to keep his mind on petty details, and off Chrissy and Patty, who were standing there watching him quietly. Brian Limperstaffer was also there, idling about in the background. He had a club foot and should have been killed at birth, but he was the only child the Staffers had ever had, and Staffer was parson after all, maybe mayor too, since there wasn't anyone left. There was no affection whatsoever between Johnny and Brian Limper. During the funeral dancing, Brian Limper had just sat on the sidelines making sneering remarks about the dancing, about the funeral, about the meat, about the strawberries. But when he had made a remark about Johnny's father, maybe never had a bone in the right place, Johnny had hit him with a backhand cuff. It made Johnny ashamed of himself, hitting a cripple. Brian Limper stood crookedly, a faint blue bruise upon his cheek, watching Johnny get ready, wishes of bad luck written all over his face. Two of the boys of similar age, there were only 5 in the whole village, who were there in their late teens, wandered up and asked Brian Limper what's going on. Brian shrugged. Johnny kept his mind carefully upon his business. He was probably taking too much, but he didn't know what he'd run into. Nobody knew. In the 2 buckskin sacks he was roping on either side of the lead horse, he had flint stones for fire, rat's nests for tinder, bundles of cut thongs, some sharp-edged rocks that were sometimes hard to find and cut indifferently well, 3 spare kill clubs, 1 heavy enough to crush a bear's skull, just in case, some warm robes that didn't stink very much, a couple of buckskins for spare clothes. He gave a start. He hadn't realized Chrissy had come within a foot of him. He hoped he wouldn't have to talk. Blackmail. That's what it was. Plain as possible and all bad. and she hadn't said she would kill herself if he didn't come back. Well, one could have put that down to girl vaporings, but threatening to follow him in a year put another shadow on it entirely. It meant he would have to be cautious. He'd have to be careful not to get himself killed. It was one thing to worry about his own life. He didn't care a snap for risk or danger. But the thought of Chrissy coming down onto the plains, and if he didn't come back, made him snow cold at the pit of his stomach. She'd be gored or mauled or eaten alive, and every agonizing second of it would be Johnny's fault. She had effectively committed him to caution and care, just what she had intended. She was holding something out to him, two somethings. One was a large bone needle with a thong hole through it, and the other was a skin awl. Both were worn and polished and valuable. They were Mama's. I don't need anything. Now you have them. I won't need them. If you use your clothes, how are you going to sew new ones? The crowd had thickened. Johnny didn't need any outburst. He snatched the needle and the awl out of her hand and unlashed the sack, dropped them in, and made sure they hadn't missed and dropped out, and then relashed the sack. Chrissy stood more quietly. Johnny turned and faced her. He was a little bit shocked. There wasn't even a smudge of colour in her face. She looked like she hadn't slept and had tick fever as well. Johnny's resolution wavered. Then beyond Chrissy he saw Brian Limper, tittering and talking behind his hand to Petey Tomo. Johnny's face was tight. He grabbed Chrissy and kissed her hard. It was as though he had taken her board from an irrigation trough. The tears went down her cheeks. Now look, said Johnny, don't you follow me. She made a careful effort to control her voice. If you don't come back in a year, I will. By all the gods on high peak, Johnny. He looked at her. Then he beckoned to Windsplitter, who sidled over. With one smooth spring, he mounted, the lead rope of the other horse gripped tightly in his hand. You can have my other 4 horses, said Johnny to Chrissy. Don't eat them, they're trained. Unless you get awful hungry, of course, like in the winter. Chrissy hung on to his leg for a moment, and then she stepped back and sagged. Johnny thumped Windsplitter with a heel, and they moved off. This was going to be no wild free ride to adventure. This was going to be a tiptoe scout with care. Chrissy had seen to that. At the entrance to the defile, he looked back. About 15 people were still standing there watching him go. They all looked dejected. He used a heel to signal to make Windsplitter rear, and waved his hand. Hi-ho, Silver! They all waved back with a sudden animation. Then Johnny was gone down the dark canyon trail to the wide unknown plains. The rest of the people drifted off. Chrissy still stood there, hoping with a wild, crazy hope that he would ride into sight, returning. Patty tugged at her leg. Chrissy, will he come back? Chrissy's voice was very low, her eyes like ashes of a dead fire. Goodbye, she whispered. Turl belched. It was a polite way to attract attention. But the belch didn't make much impression through the whine and howl of machines in a transport department maintenance dome. Zit's concentration on his work became more marked. My Site 16's transport chief had little use for the security head. Every time a tool or a car or fuel turned up missing, or something was broken, it got attention from security. 3 crashed cars were strewn about in various stages of reassembly. One of them very messy with splotches of green cyclo blood. In the interior, upholstery was damaged. The big drills that dangled from the ceiling rails pointed sharp beaks this way and that, idling in their programming. Lathes with nothing in their jaws spun, waiting for something to twist and shave. Belts snarled and slapped at each other. Turl watched the surprisingly nimble talons of Zit disassemble the small concentric shells of the high-speed jet engine. Turl had hoped to detect a small tremble, maybe 1 or 2 trembles in Zit's paws. If the transport chief's conscience was bothering him, it would be much easier to do business. There was no tremble. Zit finished the disassembly and threw the last ring upon the bench. His yellow orbs contracted as he looked at Turl. Well, what have I done now? Turl lumbered closer and looked around. Where are your maintenance men? With 50 mechanics under complement, they were transferred to operations over the last month. I know it, and you know it, so why are you here? As Chief of Security, Turl had learned through experience not to be very straightforward. If he simply asked for a manual reconnaissance plane, the transport chief would demand the emergency voucher, not get it and say, no transport. And there were no emergencies for security on this dull planet, not real ones. In hundreds of years of operation, there had not been the slightest security threat to intergalactic mining operations here. A dull security scene, and consequently the chief of that department was not considered very important. Apparent threats had to be manufactured with guile as their sole ingredient. I've been investigating a suspicion of conspiracy to sabotage transport, said Turl. Kept me busy for the last 3 weeks. He eased his bulk back against a wrecked car. Don't lean on that rig on your dentist's wing. Turl decided it was better to be friendly and rumbled over to a stool at the bench where Zit was working. Confidentiality? Zit, I've had an idea that could get us some outside personnel. I'm working on it, and that's what I need. A manual recon. Zit batted his eyebrows and sat down on another stool. It creaked despairingly under his 1,000-pound bulk. This planet, said Turl confidingly, used to have a sentient race on it. What race is that? Asked Zit suspiciously. Man, says Turl. Zit looked at him searchingly. A security officer was never noted for his sense of humor. Some had been known to bait and entrap and then file charges. But Zit couldn't help himself. His mouth bones started to stretch, and even though he sought to control them, they spread, and suddenly his laugh exploded in Turl's face. Ha ha ha! Zit hastily got it under control and turned back to his bench to resume work. Anything else on your mind? This was not going well, thought Turl. Well, that's what happened when you were frank. It just didn't mix with security. This suspicion of conspiracy to sabotage transport, and he looked around the wrecked cars with half-lowered eyebrows, could reach to high places. Zit threw down a wrench with a clang, a low snarl rumbling from him. He sat there staring in front of him. He was thinking. What do you really want? He said. A recon plane. 5 or 6 days. Zit got up and yanked a transport schedule clipboard off the wall and studied it. He could hear Turl almost purring. You see the schedule, said Zit, putting it under Turl's nose. Well, yes. Do you see where it says 6 drone recons assigned to security? Well, of course I do. And do you see where this has been going on for, peel back sheet after sheet, centuries, I suppose? Have to keep a mine site planet under surveillance, said Turl complacently. Under surveillance for what? Said Zit. Every scrap of ore has been spotted and estimated long before your or my memory. There's nothing out there but mammals, air organisms. There might be a hostile landing. Here, sneered Zit. Company probes in outer offices in outer space were detected ages before it even arrived here. Turl Transport has to fuel and maintain and recondition those drones 2 or 3 times a year. You know, and I know, the company is on an economy wave. I'll tell you what. Turl waited sourly to be told. If you will let us cancel those recon drones, I'll put a tri-wheel ground vehicle at your disposal for a limited time. Turl let out a small, shrill scream. Zit amended his bargain. A ground car, at your disposal when ordered. Turl lumbered over to the crashed vehicle that had blood on its seats. I wonder if this was caused by faulty maintenance. Zit stood there, unrelenting. The crash had been caused by too much cabango on duty. One recon drone programmed to cover the whole planet once a month, said Zit. One ground car at your permanent disposal. Turo looked at the other wrecks but couldn't think of anything. These investigations were done and dead. Teach him to close investigations, that will. He wandered back to Zit. One drone recon programmed to cover the whole planet once a month. One armored and firepower ground car at permanent disposal with no questions on ammunition, breathed gas, or fuel requisitions. Zit took the forms from the bench drawer and made them out. He shoved the papers and clipboard back at Turl. As he signed, Turl thought to himself that his transport chief really ought to be looked into. Maybe for ore robbery. Zit took the papers back and removed from the keyboard the combination key card and the oldest, rattiest ground car that gathered dust in the garage dome. He coupled it with a carbon book for ammo, another briefcase, and another for fuel. The deal would never actually become part of recorded history as a deal, for the dates of the order were carefully not coincidental. Neither suspected that they had just materially altered the future of the planet, and not for the better of Intergalactic. That is sometimes the way with large commercial companies. When Turl had left to get his Mark II armored, fire-powered ground car, Zit thought to himself that it was wonderful what lies executives told just to be able to go hunting. Kill mad they all were, machine mad too. From the jam-ups he had to repair, what a story. Man, a sentient race indeed. He laughed and got back to work. Johnny Goodboy Tyler galloped free across the vast ocean of grass, Wind Splitter exuberantly stretching his legs, the lead horse rollicking along behind. What a day! Blue sky and the wind a cooling freshness upon his face. Now 2 days out, he had come down from the mountains, through the foothills, and into the vastest plain he had ever imagined. He could still see the tiniest tip of High Peak behind him, and with the sun it kept him true on course and reassured him that he could find his way home whenever he wanted. Total security. The herds of wild cattle were many, but he had been living with that all his life. A few wolves. But what were wolves? No bear, no puma so far. Why, in all reverence to the gods, did anybody ever stay cooped up in the mountains? And monsters. What monsters? Ha! Crazy tales. Even that shiny floating cylinder that had gone overhead every few days the whole of his life was overdue down here. It had come from the west to east with the regularity of every other heavenly body, but even it seemed to have stopped. On his present course he should have seen it. In short, Johnny Goodboy Tyler was suffering from a bad case of overconfidence, and the first disaster that hit him had to do with pigs. Pigs were usually easy to kill, if you were a bit nimble and watched out for the charge of the boars, and a small suckling pig was exactly what he could use for supper. Right there ahead of him, clear in the late afternoon light, was a compact herd of pigs out in the open. There were big ones and small ones, but they were all fat. Johnny pulled Winspector to a halt and slid off. The wind was not quite right, a bit too downwind for the pigs. They smelled him if he approached directly. With a bent knee run, he brought himself silently around them until the wind was at right angles. He stopped and hefted his club. The tall grass was nearly to his waist. The pigs were rooting around a shallow depression on the plain, where water stood in wet mounds, making a temporary marsh. There must be roots to be had there. There were dozens of pigs, every one with his snout down. With the crouching gait staying below the grass tops, Johnny went forward, closing the distance yard by yard. Only a few feet separated him now from the outermost fringe of pigs. Silently he rose until his eyes were just above the level of the grass. A small porker, sounds like my ex, was only 3 arm spans from him. An easy throw. Here's for supper, breathed Johnny, and heaved his kill club straight and true at the head of the pig. Dead on, a direct hit. The pig let out an ear-splitting snare and dropped. But that wasn't all that happened. Instant confusion roared, hidden from Johnny by the tall grass, and slightly behind him to his right, a 500-pound boar, who had made tired of eating and had lain down for a nap. The squeal of the hit pig acted like a whip on the whole herd, and away they went in an instant charge, straight upwind at Johnny's horses. For the big boar to see was to charge. Johnny felt like he had been struck by a mountain avalanche. He was knocked flat and squashed in instants so close together they felt like one. He rolled, but the whole sky went over him was filled with boar belly. He didn't see but sensed the teeth and tusks trying to find him. He rolled again, the savage squeals mixing with the roaring blood pounding in his ears. Once more he rolled, and this time he saw daylight and a back. In the blink of an eye, he was on the boar's back. He reached an arm across the throat. The boar spun around and around like a bucking horse. Johnny's arm tightened until he could feel his sinews crack, and then the boar, strangled, dropped into a limp, jerking pile. Johnny unloaded quickly and backed up. The boar was gasping its breath back. It lurched to unsteady feet, and seeing no opponent, staggered off. Johnny went over and picked up the small pig, keeping an eye on the departing boar. But the boar, although it cast about and made small convulsive charges, still couldn't see anybody. And after a bit it trotted off in the direction the herd had taken, following the trampled grass. There was no herd in sight. There were no horses in sight. No horses! Johnny stood there with a dead pig. He had no sharp rocks to cut it. He had no flints to dart a fire so he could roast it, and he had no horses. It might be worse. He looked at his legs, expecting to see tusk gashes, but he found none. His back and face ached a bit from the collision on the charge, and his own collision with the ground, but that was all. Mentally kicking himself, more ashamed than scared, he made off in the direction of the trail of crushed grass. After a while, his depression wore off a bit, to be replaced by optimism. He began to whistle a call. The horses would not have just gone running in front of the pigs. They would have veered off somewhere. Just as darkness was falling, he spotted Winspeter, calmly cropping grass. The horse looked up with a, "Where the hell have you been?" And then with a plainly mischievous grin, though he had intended to do it all the time, came over and bumped Johnny with his muzzle. It took another 10 minutes of anxious casting about to locate the lead horse and the packs. Johnny went back a short way to a little spring they had made, where they had passed and made camp. There he made himself a belt and a pouch, and into the latter he put a tinder and flint and some small sharpened stones. He put a stronger thong on the kill club and fastened it to his belt. He wasn't going to be caught empty-handed a second time, not in this vast prairie. No, indeed. That night he dreamed of Chrissy, being strangled by pigs, Chrissy mauled by bears, Chrissy, crushed to a pulp under stampeding hooves, while he stood helpless in the sky where his spirits go, and unable to do a damned thing. The great village, where thousands had lived, was obviously another one of those myths, like the monsters. But he would look for it nonetheless. By half-light of the yellowing dawn, Johnny was again trotting eastward. The plain was changing. There were even some features about it that didn't seem usual, such as those mounds. Johnny detoured from his way into the sun to look at one of them. He stopped, leaning slightly forward with a hand braced on Winspeter's shoulder, to study the place. It was like a little sort of a hill, but it had a hole in the side, a rectangular hole. Otherwise the mound was all covered with dirt and grass. Some freak of nature? A window opening? He slid off his horse and approached it. He walked around it, then he paced it out. It was about 35 paces long, 10 paces wide. Ha! Maybe the mound was rectangular too. An old splintered stump stood to one side, and Johnny approached a jagged piece of it. He approached the window and, using a scrap of wood, began to push away the grass edges. It surprised him that he seemed to be digging not in earth, but in loose sand. When he got to the lower part of the rectangle cleared, he could get right up to it and look into it. The mound was hollow. He backed up and looked at his horses, then around the countryside. There wasn't anything menacing there. He bent over and started to crawl into the mound, and the window bit him. He straightened right up and looked at his wrist. It was bleeding. It wasn't a bad cut. It was just that he was cut at all that startled him. Very carefully he looked out the window. It had teeth. Well, maybe they weren't teeth. They were dull bright and had lots of colours in them, and they stood out all around the outside of the frame. He pulled one of them out. They were very loose. He took a bit of thong from his belt and tried it. Wonder of wonders, the tooth readily cut the thong far better than the best rock edge. Hey, he thought, delighted, look what I got. And with the greatest care, for the things did bite unless you were careful, he removed the splinters, big and small, from the frame and stacked them very neatly. He went up to his pack and got a piece of buckskin and wrapped them up. Valuable! You could cut and skin and scrape something wonderful with these things. Some kind of rock, or this mound of the skull of some strange beast. And these were the remains of his teeth. Wonderful! When he had them all, and they were carefully stowed in his pack, except one nice bit he put in his belt pouch, he returned to the task of entering the mound. There was nothing to bite him now, and he climbed through the rectangle. There wasn't any pit. The level of the inside seemed to be a bit higher than the outside ground. A sudden flurry startled him, half out of his wits, but it was just a bird that had made a nest inside, and it left through the window with a rustle of wings. Once outside, it found a place to sit and began to scold and scold. Johnny fumbled his way through the dimness. There wasn't much there, mainly rust, but there had been things there. He could tell from the rust piles, the marks upon the wall. Walls, yes, the place had walls. There was some sort of rough stone or something, very evenly fitted together in big square blocks. Yes, these were walls. No animal made anything like this, and no animal made anything like this tray. It must have been part of something else. Now something turned to reddish powder. At the bottom of the powder were some circular discs, about as big as 3 thumbnails, and at the bottom of the pile of discs was one that was almost bright. Johnny picked it up and turned it over. He caught his breath. He moved over to the window where there was better light. There could be no mistake. It was a big bird with spread wings and arrows gripped within its claws. The same sign he had found in the tomb. He stood in quivering excitement for a bit and then calmed down. He had it now. The mystery was solved, and he went back out the window and showed Winspeter. God House, said Johnny. This is where they stayed while waiting to take great men up to the tomb. Pretty, isn't it? Winspeter finished chewing a mouthful of grass and gave Johnny a shove in the chest. It was time they were going. Johnny put the disc in his belt pouch. Well, it was no great village, but it proved definitively that there were things to find out here in the plains. Walls. Imagine that. Those gods could build walls. The birds stopped scolding him, and in some relief, and Johnny mounted up and moved away. It looked after the little cavalcade, and then, with a couple more criticisms, went back inside. Turl was as happy as a baby cyclo on a diet of straight curbango. Although it was late in the day, he was on his way. He steered the Mark II ground car, really a tank, down the ramp, through the atmosphere port, and into the open air. There was a warning plaque on the ledge in front of the driver's seat. Battle readiness must be observed at all times. Although this tank is compression contained, personal face masks and independent breathing systems must be kept in place. Personnel and unauthorized battle use prohibited. Signed, the political department, Intergalactic Mining Company, Vice Director, SOT. Tyrrell grinned at the sign. In the absence of political officers, on a planet where there were no indigenous politics, and in the absence of a War Department, on a planet that had nothing to go to war against, the Chief of Security covered both of those functions. That this very old battle car existed on the planet at all meant that it must be very, very old, and in addition must have gotten there as a result of fixed allocations of vehicles to company stations. Clerks in Planet 1, Galaxy 1 offices were not always well advised when they wrote their endless directives and orders to the far-flung outposts of the commercial empire. Tyrrell threw his face mask and tank into the gunner's seat, and he rubbed a thankful paw over his craggy face. What's a lark? The old car ran like a well-greased digger, small, not much more than 30 feet long and 10 feet high. It skimmed above the ground like a low-flying wingless bird. Cunning mathematics had contoured it, so that every exterior surface would make a hostile projectile glance off at an angle. Missile-proof glass slots gave a fine view of the terrain. Even the blast muzzles of his artillery were cleverly recessed. The interior upholstery, though worn and cracked in places, was a beautiful, soothing shade of purple. Tyrrell felt good. He had 5 days of jet fuel and breathe gas, 5 days of rations in their 10-pound packs. He had cleaned up every scrap of paper in his baskets and had started no new emergencies. He had borrowed shaft analysis picture recorder that would take great pictures when put to other uses. And he was on his way. A break in the dull life of a security chief on a planet without insecurities. A planet that wasn't likely to produce many opportunities for an ambitious security chief to get promotion or advancement. It had been a gut blow when they had ordered him to Earth. He wondered at once what he had done, whom he had accidentally insulted, whose bad side he had gotten on. But they assured him that none of these was the case. He was young. A silo had a lifespan of about 190 years, and Tur was only about 39 when he had been appointed. It was pointed out to him that few ever became security chiefs at such a tender age. It would show in his record that he had been one, and when he came back from his duty tour, they would see. Plums like planets you could breathe on went to older cycles. He had not been fooled, really. Nobody's security personnel pool, Planet 1, Galaxy 1, had wanted anything at all to do with this post. He could hear the future assignment interview now. Last post? Earth. Where? Earth. Rimstar. Third planet. Secondary galaxy. 16. Oh. What did you accomplish on that post? It's all on the record. Yes, but there's nothing in the record. There must be something. Let me see it. No. Confidential. Company record. And then the final horror. Employee Tyrrell. It just happens that we have an opening in another rim star system, Galaxy 32. It's a quiet place. No indigenous life. No atmosphere whatsoever. Or even worse. Employee Tyrrell. Intergalactic has been dropping some time on the exchanges, so we're got orders to economize. I'm afraid your record doesn't recommend continued employment. Don't call us. We'll call you. He already had a bit of a scribble on the wall. A month ago, he'd received word that his tour duty had been extended, and there was no mention of his relief. A little bit of horror had touched him, a vision of a 190-year-old Tyrrell, tottering around on this same planet, long forgotten by friends and family, ending his days in a dumb, crazy stupor, lowered into a slit trench grave and ticked off the roster by a clerk who kept the records neat but didn't know a single face upon them. Such questionable fates required action, big action. There are better daydreams waiting in a big entrance hall, uniformed ushers to attention, but one of them whispering to the other, "Who's that?" And the other, "Don't you know? That's Tyrrell." And the big doors opening, The president of the company is waiting to thank you, sir. Please come this way. According to the mine surveys, there was an ancient highway to the north of here. Toro flipped the ground car onto also and spread out the big map. There it was, running east and west was where he wanted to go. It would be busted up and overgrown, or maybe even hard to spot, but it would have no steep grades, and it would run squarely up into the mountains. Toro had drawn a big circle around the target meadow. There was the highway ahead. He threw the controls to manual and fumbled a bit. He hadn't driven one of these things since security school, years before, and his uncertainty controlling these vehicles made the car yaw from side to side. He sooned up the side embankment, hit the road and yanked back on the throttles and pulled at the brakes. The car slammed to earth in a geysering puff of dust, square in the center of the highway. It was a pretty jolting stop, but not too bad. He'd get better at it. He picked up his face mask and tank and donned them. Then he hit the decompression button so the tanks would recontain the breathe gas without waste. There was a momentary vacuum, a trifle uncomfortable, a bit painful on the hearing bones, and then there was a sigh. The outside air entered the cab. Turo swung open the top hatch and stood up on the seat, the tank creaking with shuddering under his repositioned weight. The wind felt cool outside the borders of his face mask. He gazed around with some distaste. This sure was a wide country, and empty. The only sound was the whisper of wind in the grass, and the sound of silence. Vast silence. Even a far-off bird call made the silence heavier. The earth was tan and brown. The grass and the occasional shrubs were green. The sky was an expansive blue, speckled with white puffs of clouds. A strange country. People on home planet wouldn't believe it. No purple anywhere. With a sudden inspiration, Turo reached down to the car and grabbed the picture recorder. He aimed it in a sweeping circle, letting it grind away. He sent his folks a spool of this. Then they'd believe him when he said it was one horn's awful of a planet, and maybe sympathize with him. My daily view, he said, into the recorder as he finished the sweep. The words rumbled through his mask, sounding sad. There was something purple. Straight west, there were some mountains, and they looked purple. He put the picture recorder down and grinned at the mountains so far away. This was better than he imagined. No wonder men lived up in the mountains. They were purple. Maybe the men were a bit sentient after all. He hoped so, but not with any great confidence. He was probably optimistic, but it gave some substance to his nebulous plans. Still looking westward, he suddenly caught sight of a landscape feature between himself and the mountains, a distant skyline silhouetted against the declining sun. He shifted the lever on his face mask to get a magnification. The skyline leaped closer. Yes, he was right. There was a ruined city, fuzzy and broken, but the buildings still very tall and quite extensive. The wind fluttered his mind map as he looked at it. The ancient highway ran straight west into it. Reaching down, he took a massive tomb of the pile of the rear of the seat and opened it to a marked place. There was an insert drawing on the page. Some cultural artist had sketched it a few centuries before. The company had used air-breathing chinkos for cultural posts. On planets where there was air, the chinkos had come from Galaxy 2, beings as tall as cyclones, but thread-thin and delicate. Sound familiar? They were an old race, and the cyclones didn't like to admit they had learned what they knew of cultural arts from them. But they had been easy to transport despite breathing air and being feather-light, and they were cheap. Alas, they were no more, not even in Galaxy 2, having initiated a strike of all things, Intergalactic had wiped them out. But that was long after the culture and ethnology department had been terminated on Earth. Turo had never seen a Chinko. Remarkable beings, drawing pictures like this, colourful too, Why would anybody draw something? He compared the distant skyline to the sketch. Aside from a bit of blunting and crumbling for the ensuing years, they were the same. The text said, "To the eastward of the mountains lies the ruins of a man city remarkably well preserved. It was a man city called Denver. It is not as aesthetically advanced as those in the middle or eastern part of the continent. The usual miniature doors have little or no ornamentation. The interiors are no more than slightly oversized dollhouses. Utility rather than artistry seems to have been the overall architectural purpose. There are 3 cathedrals which were apparently devoted to the worship of different heathen gods, showing that the culture was not monosectarian, even though it may have been dominated by priesthoods. One god, Bank, or Vey, seems to have been more general in worship. There was a man library remarkably well stocked with books. The department sealed some of the library rooms after removing to archives the only important volumes, those on mining. As no ore bodies were evident under the foundations and no valuable ore materials were employed in the indigenous population for its construction, the man city remains in a remarkable state of preservation. Aided in part by the dry climate, the cost of further restoration is being requisitioned." Turl laughed to himself. No wonder the Culture and Ethnology Department had been phased out on this planet. He's applying for credits to reconstruct man cities. He could hear the counterblast from the directors now. They fair put a shaft through the heads of such arty types. Well, it was data he might use in his plans, but who knew? He got back to the business at hand. There was the highway stretching out. He was right in the middle of it. It was a couple of 100 feet wide at this point, and it could clearly be discerned. It probably had been 2 or 3 feet of sand on top of it, but the growing grass was uniform and the shrubs to either side not be able to put down roots directly on it, defined their true edges in a row, giving it a straight course. Turl took another look around. There were some cattle, a small herd of horses in the distance, nothing worth shooting, since no silo could eat meat of that metabolic type. Something dangerous enough to offer sport. It was luxurious to have time to think about hunting, and even to be equipped for it, and even more luxurious not to do it. He had a bigger game going anyway. He dropped it down into the driver's seat and punched the buttons to close at the top. The unbreathable air exhausted from the cab and was replaced by proper gas. He took off his face mask, contrary to regulations, and dropped it into the gunner's seat. The purple interior was a relief to his nerves. This confounded planet. It even looked bad through the purple tint of the windscreens. He glanced again at the ramp. Now was the time for some luck. He knew he couldn't go up into the mountains themselves due to the uranium the recon drones always indicated in that area. But the recon drones also reported that these man-things sometimes came down to the mountain foothills. And they were safe enough. Turl thought over his plans again. They were beautiful plans. Personal wealth, personal power. The recon drones had told him more than others knew. The scans had pointed out a vein of almost solid gold. It was uncovered by a landslide after intergalactic surveys were finalized. A delicious, fabulously rich vein of gold in plain sight. A vein about which the company was ignorant, since the landslide was recent and Turl had destroyed the records. A joke on Zit to propose no more recon drones over the area. The uranium count in the area also made the mountains were formidable, and so no silo could mine it. Even a few bits of uranium dust could explode silo breathe gas. Turl smiled at his own genius. All he needed was a man-thing, and then a few more man-things. They could mine the gold. And to blast with uranium. Somehow he would get the gold off the planet and home. And he had ideas about how he could do that too. Then wealth and power and no more of this place. All the security chief had to do was to keep others from suspecting what he was really doing, to advertise quite other reasons. But Turl was an expert at that. If he were truly lucky, he could catch a man-thing this side of the meadow. He did not have too much time to lie in wait. He felt lucky. The sun was very low, thanks to his late start. He'd lie up in that man city for the night, sleeping in the car. He sent the Mark II skimming along the ancient highway. A skyline! Johnny Goodboy Tyler pulled up with a yank so sudden it startled Windsplitter into a rear. Meh! There it was, straight east. It wasn't hills or mountains, it was some trick of the eye. It couldn't be. It was sharp and rectangular. He had been so unconvinced. When he had left the ancient ruin, he found a very cosy way to travel. It was almost as if the ruin with the window had once had a broad path leading to it. There were shrubs on the right and shrubs on the left, 2 rows about 200 feet apart, that dwindled eastward into the distance. Underfoot there was fairly even grass. You had to watch it a bit because there were shallow gullies in places. When you looked down between these little gullies, there was something grey-white. Johnny had inspected it with care. He had gotten down and dug at the edges of such a crack, and it seemed that the grey-white stuff was continuous, just like the inner walls of the ruin. Maybe it was a wall of the ancients, fallen over sideways, but no, it would have cracked as it fell. Outside the courthouse it hung. Level stones had been laid at the pavement. But who wanted a pavement 200 feet wide, an hour's journey long? For what? This big path had been used for a long time, if it was indeed a path. It went between hillocks that had been sliced into, and it went across watercourses, although it was pretty irregular and broken in these. He had been excited for a while, but then he got used to it and devoted his attention mainly to keeping Windsplitter from tripping in the little gullies. When he had been a little boy, one of the families had a wheeled cart, and they hauled firewood in it. And he had been told that once there had been a lot of carts, even one that had been pulled by a mare. Well, you could sure roll a cart on this white turf, and run it fast and far. But as to the great village, he was coming to believe, as the afternoon wore on, that somebody had probably seen that god house back there and multiplied it in his imagination. And then suddenly there it was. But was it? He put Windsplitter up to a trot, regardless of the little gullies. In the clear air the skyline wasn't coming his way very fast. It even appeared to be receding. He stopped. Maybe it was a trick of the eye after all. But no, the lines it made were clear up and down, and flat on top. And there was an awful lot of it. It wasn't hills or mountains, only building sides could be that regular. He started up again, more sedately, remembering now to be careful, and after a while he could see that he was getting closer. The sun was coming down, and he wasn't there yet. The prospect of entering that place in the dark was definitely not cheering. Who knew what it might be full of? Ghosts, gods, people, monsters? And no, not monsters. They were just the stuff of mammas frightening the kids to sleep with. He pulled off the path where it crossed a stream and made camp. He warmed up some of his roasted pork and then cut it with one of his sharp, shiny things he had taken out of the window. My, he marveled, imagine anything cutting like that. It would make life a real pleasure. You had to watch not to cut your own fingers, of course, but he had already done twice, slightly. Maybe you could just bed the cutting edge in wood or something for a handle, and then you would really have something special. After supper he built up his fire to keep the wolves off. A couple were sitting over there now, amber-eyed in the reflected firelight, and looking hungry. "Run away," shouted Johnny, "or I'll be wearing your hides." But the wolves just stood there. And then they called out, "I'm gonna fuck you in the ass, bitch!" Sorry, couldn't resist. Windsplitter and the lead horse didn't want to go away from the fire. The wolves made them nervous. So Johnny picked up a couple of rocks, fist-sized from the nearby stream bed. He wasn't interested in hunting wolves, but his horses had to find grass. He threw a pork bone about 10 feet beyond the fire in the direction of the wolves. Big, rangy things they were, one sunk forward, belly low, snarling to reach the pork bone. In a moment, the wolf's attention would be fixed upon the bone. Johnny's arm blurred. The firewolf caught the rock squarely between his eyes. Johnny's arm blurred again. The near wolf didn't jump in time, and he too was a dead wolf. Johnny said to Windsplitter, "I got to do all the work, is that it?" And he walked over to the firewolf and hauled the carcass to the fire. Then he dragged the closer one in. Nope, neither one had a pelt worth taking at this time of the year anyway. And they had ticks too. "Go on and eat," he told the horses. He built the fire up again, just in case. Never know, the wolves might have friends. And rolled up his robes. Tomorrow was going to be the day. Johnny approached the great village cautiously. He was up before first light, and the yellow dawn found him on the outskirts of the place, peering, halting, looking closer at the strange sights, nervous. Sand lay over everything, and grass and even scrub grew in the wide paths between the buildings. He gave a start every time a rabbit or a rat came tearing out of the ancient structures, disturbed by his footfalls. Even though the hooves were muffled by the grass and sand, the silence of the place was so intense that any disturbance of it seemed overloud. He had never heard an echo before to notice it. The return of sound caused him a great deal of worry. For a little while he thought there must be another horse walking in the distance, but at last he worked it out. He hit his wrist kill club against the bottom of his belt, and promptly heard the same sound repeated softly, like a mockery. He waited, but no further mock occurred. Then he hit the clubs together again, and the same sound returned. He decided it didn't happen unless he did it first. He looked about him. To both his left and his right were the tall remains of buildings, very tall indeed. Pitted by various wind erosion, discolored by endless centuries of weather, they still stood, flat and even and imposing. Astonishing! Whoever could build such things? Gods, perhaps? He eyed the massive size of the building and the blocks. No man could lift one by himself. Johnny sat his horse in the middle of what must have been the main path of the great village. He frowned, strained to comprehend the building of such a place. Many men? But how could they reach so high? He concentrated laboriously. Gradually he could conceive of one built up steps of logs, and if many men put ropes around a block, and if they carried it up the steps and then took the steps away, they might have done it. Marvelous, dizzy, and dangerous, but it was possible. Satisfied that it didn't need gods or monsters to have made this place, and therefore very relieved, he continued his exploration. He wondered whether some odd kind of tree had grown along this path. He got down and looked at the stump of one. It was hard and jagged, and it had been hollow, and it was deep in the strange rock. It wasn't wood, it was a reddish metal, and when you scraped away the red powder, underneath was black. He looked up and down both sides of the wide path. The placing of these things was very precise, although he couldn't figure out what they were for. It was obvious that, like buildings, they were placed objects. The innumerable windows surrounding him seemed to stare back at him. The morning sun had come now, and it shone into those that faced it. Here and there were vast surfaces of the shiny stuff he had collected from the mound on the plain. It was not clear. It was whitish and bluish, like the cataracts of an old man's eyes. But there were whole sheets of it in some places. He began to realize it was some kind of covering, perhaps to keep out the cold and heat, and yet let in the light. People at home sometimes did that using a tissue of animal stomachs. But those that had built the great village had access to some kind of rock or hard substance that came in sheets. They must have been very clever people. He saw a great yawning doorway ahead of him. The doors had fallen away and lay there, half buried in the sand. The inside of the building gaped darkly. Johnny walked his horse through the door and looked about in the dimness. Debris was scattered all about, rotted and decayed beyond identification. But a waist-high series of platforms stood. They of a remarkably white stone that had bluish veins in it. He leaned down from his horse and stared at the wall behind them. There were heavy, heavy doors set into it, 2 of them ajar, one of them wide open. Big wheels of still bright metal inset into them. Johnny stepped to the platform of white stone and dropped to the other side. Cautiously he approached the open niche. There were shelves, and on the shelves, tangled with rotten remains of some kind of sacking, were mounds and mounds and mounds of discs. Some were dull grey, almost tarnished away, but one pile was bright yellow. Johnny picked up a disc. It was as wide across as 2 fingernails, and remarkably heavy. He turned it over with his eyes. They bulged his eyes. Here was that bird again, talons gripping a bundle of arrows. Hastily he poured into the other mounds, looking at disc after disc. Most of them had a bird on one side, the face of a man. The faces of different men were on the other. Faces of a man, and some of them had women on them. This was not a god symbol. This was a man symbol. The bird with the arrows belonged to man. The shock of it sent him reeling. He supported himself against the wall of the niche for a few minutes. His head was buzzing, trying to adjust his mind to these new ideas. These doors to the niches were man-made. Telephone box. Just got it, sorry. These doors with the niches were man-made. The great village was man-made. The doors to the tomb in the mountains were of a similar material, even if they were larger. The tomb was not a god tomb. The mound out on the plain was also man-made. Man had once built things. He was certain of it. And it would take many men to make this great village. Therefore there must have been many, many men at one time. He rode his horse out of the place in a deep haze. His most basic ideas and values had suffered severe shifts, and it took a lot of getting used to. What legends were true? Which ones were false? There was a legend of the great village, and here it was. Man had obviously made it and had lived here in time forgotten. Maybe the legend of God getting angry with man and wiping him out was true, and maybe it wasn't. Maybe it had just been a big storm. He looked around the paths and buildings. There was no evidence of a storm. The buildings were still standing. Many even had that strange, thin sheeting in the windows. There were no bodies about, but from a time so long ago, the bones wouldn't last. And then he saw a structure that had its doors firmly closed with sheets of metal, fastened where the window should be. And looking closer, he saw that a huge metal clamp sealed the place. He got down and inspected the clamp. It was of a different age than the village. There was no tarnish on it at all. It was old, but not that old. Something or someone at some time had pushed aside the sand in front of the doors. It was grass-grown sand, but still it had been disturbed. Johnny frowned. This building was not like the rest. It was in a fair state of preservation. Somebody had put metal sheets on the windows, and the metal was quite different from any in the rest of the town. It showed no signs of corrosion. Somebody had given this building special treatment. He backed up to get a better overall view. It was indeed a different kind of building. Fewer windows, block solid. As an experienced tracker, Johnny studied the time differences here. Long after the village had been abandoned, somebody had made access to this place, made a path, dug to the doors, and then fastened the doors securely. But even that had been a long time ago. Curious, he scanned the front facade. One of the metal window covers was loose. It was higher than his head, so he stood on his horse and pried it open. It gave a little bit. Encouraged, he shoved the handle of his kill club into the crack, and with a protesting whine, the cover suddenly sprang loose, startling Windsplitter, who moved off. Johnny was left dangling from the ledge, his feet above the ground. He pulled himself up. The transparent sheeting under the window was still in place. He took his kill club and managed to hit it. The crash and tinkle of the stuff as it fell was shockingly loud in his quiet place. Experienced now with the cutting quality of the stuff, Johnny hung to the ledge with his one arm and cleaned up the jagged bits from one side of the frame and dusted off the ledge. He pulled himself through. The place was so dark that it took quite a while to see anything. Light was coming in through thin cracks where other windows remained covered. At length his eyes adjusted, and he dropped cautiously down into the huge room. Now that he was not blocking the window's light, he could see quite well. Dust and sand were covered a filmy... I'm dying for a drink. I need water. Dust and sand were only a filmy covering over things. There were tables and tables and tables and chairs and chairs and chairs, all marshaled into orderly rows. But they were not the interesting things. Almost every wall was covered with shelving. The stacks of shelves even protruded out into the room. Somebody had covered them with a sheeting you could see through. Something lay underneath the sheeting on every shelf. Johnny approached cautiously. He carefully removed the fastenings to the sheeting and looked behind it. Queer, thick rectangles stood on these shelves, rows of them. At first he thought it was all one piece, and then he found he could remove a single rectangle. He took one off the shelf. It almost fell to pieces in his hands. Awkwardly, he juggled to hold it together, and then succeeded. What a strange object! It was a box. It wasn't a box. The covers slid sideways away from each other, enclosing a packet of thin, remarkably thin slices that had black marks on them. Lots of little tiny black marks, all in orderly rows. What a strange object! How complicated! He put the first one back on the shelf and took a second, smaller one. It too fell open. Johnny found himself staring at a picture. It didn't have depth. At first it just seemed to, but his finger told him it was just a flat plane. The object there was a big red circle, much bigger than a strawberry, much smoother. It had a stem, and alongside it there was a black tent with a crossbar in the middle of it. He turned the sheet. There was a picture of a bee. No bee was ever that big, but this was certainly a bee. It, too, looked three-dimensional until he put his finger on it, and it told him it wasn't. And a black thing beside it had two bulges on it. Johnny turned another sheet. There was a cat, a small cat, to be sure, but it was definitely a cat, and it had a curved black thing like a new moon. A few pages later, there was a picture of a fox, and beside it was a black pole with two flags coming off it. Suddenly a quiver went through Johnny. He held his breath. He grabbed the first object he had taken and pried it open again. There was a tent. There was the bee's black mark. Yes, and there was a pole with two flags. He held the two rectangles, his head in a whirl. He stared at them. There was a meaning here. Foxes, bees, cats, tents, bulges, new moons. These things had meanings in them. But about what? Animals? Weather? He could sort all that out later. He crowded the two rectangles into his belt. Anything that was connected to weather and animals had value. Rectangles with meaning in them, the idea made bright lights pop in your skull. He replaced the protective sheet, went back to the window, replaced the metal covering as well as he could, whistled Windsplitter over, dropping down to the horse's back. Johnny looked around him expansively. Who knew what things of enormous value were in the great village? He felt rich, excited. There was no reason at all for his people to stay cooped up in there in the mountains. Here there was shelter, and shelter to spare. Here there was firewood growing in the streets. Here there were rooms and rooms and rooms. Come to think of it, he felt better since he had been away from the mountains. That meadow, he felt better physically. And it hadn't taken a year. Actually, just a few days. He gathered up the lead rope of his pack horse, and they trotted briskly along the wide paths toward the eastern part of the great village. Although his eyes were busy taking it all in, his mind was engrossed in organizing a migration from the mountain down to this place, what he would have to pick up for evidence to convince them, what he was going to say to Stafford, how they could transport their goods, maybe build a cart. Maybe there were carts right here in the great village. He could round up some horses. These piles of red dust he saw along either side of the wide pass from time to time, must have been carts of a sort. It was hard to figure out what shape they had really been. They were so caved in. The impression of a wheel, sheets of translucent rock. No, they hadn't been horse carts. Or had they? He began to look at such objects more closely. And then he saw the insect. It was very bright daylight now, and there it sat. There could be no mistaking it. Alien. Surely it must be an insect. Only cockroaches look like that. Or beetles. No, cockroaches. But there were no cockroaches that big. Not 30 feet long, and at least 10 feet high, and maybe 12 feet side to side. A horrible brown color and smooth. Johnny had stopped, the lead horse bunched up behind. The thing was sitting squarely in the middle of the wide path. It seemed to have two eyes in front, slitted. There was nothing like this on the plains or in the mountains, and he had never seen anything like it in the village center. It looked new, with very little dust on it, and shiny. He felt it was alive. There was something about it, yes, alive. Not inanimate metal, but a living thing. Then he saw what made him think so. There had been a slight rocking motion. Something moved behind the slitted eyes. Johnny, making no sudden movements, turned Windsplitter and, pulling the lead horse behind him, he began to move away in the direction from which he had approached. He had already noted that these paths were mostly rectangular, and that you could go all the way around a group of buildings and come back to the same place. There was open country to the east, not very far. He would go down a side path and then circle back and get into the plains. Hopefully he could outrun it, well, if it moved. There was an ear-splitting roar. Johnny glanced back in terror. The thing rose up 3 feet above the ground. Dust flew from below it. It began to inch forward. It was alive. He put Windsplitter into a gallop straight down the street. He passed one corner path, 2, 3. The thing was falling behind. It was now 2 corners back. He swerved Windsplitter up a side path, yanking the lead horse with him. They reached another corner, and again he turned. Up ahead were 2 tall buildings. He'd keep going and reach the open country. He'd make it. And then suddenly there was a sheet of flame. Ahead of him, the right-hand building exploded apart. Its top slid slowly down into the street ahead, blocking it. Splattered with dust, Johnny hurled up short. He could hear the roaring of the thing. Somewhere beyond the rubble, he listened, holding his breath. The position of the roar was changing. It was shifting to the right. He traced it with his ears. It was going down the other side street. Now it was level with him. Now it was getting behind him. The thing had somehow blocked the street ahead of him, then gone on, planning to come up behind him. He was trapped. Johnny looked at the smoking mound of fresh rubble ahead of him. It rose 20 feet above the pavement, a steep barricade. There was no panic in him now. He slowed the heart-pounding of his heart. The thing to do was wait until the monster was right in the street behind him, then go over the barricade. He sidled Windsplitter back to get a good run. The thing was roaring down the side path behind him. Now it was turning. He glanced back. There it was, wisps of smoke coming out of its nostrils. Johnny put his heel to a wind splitter. He yanked on the lead rope. Yee-haw! Shouted Johnny. The horses sprinted at the barricade, rough and full of loose stones. It's dangerous. As they scrambled, Robbers slid, pray the gods no broken legs. Up they went. They hit the top. One glance back showed the thing rolling up to the very bottom of the barricade. Johnny sent the horses down in a turmoil of tumbling debris. They hit the street before them at a run and kept on running. The walls racketing with the thunder of their run, Johnny swerved through the checkerboard of paths, edging to the open country. He could not hear the roaring thing now over the powerful thud of the running hooves. Further and further the buildings were thinning. He saw open country between the two structures to his right. He skidded off down the embankment and raced for freedom. As soon as he was free, running space everywhere, but toward the town he slowed. Windsplitter and the lead horse were blowing and puffing. He walked them until they caught their breath, casting his eyes restlessly up and down the edges of the town behind them. Then he caught the roaring again. He strained his eyes, watching. There it was. It slid out amongst the buildings and stared and started straight toward him. He put the horses up to a trot. The thing was closing the distance. He put the horses up to a run. The thing was not only closed the distance, but started to pass him. Johnny swerved at right angles. The thing banked into a turn and flashed by him, went well ahead, then turned and blocked his way. Johnny pulled up. There it was, ugly, roaring, gleaming. He turned around and began to run away from it. It let out a blasting roar, scorched by him, and stopped, blocking his way. Johnny's face tightened into determination. He took his biggest kill club from his belt. He put the thong solidly on his wrist. He cast off the lead horse. Walking Windsplitter, he went up ahead of the thing. It didn't move. He went about 100 feet in front of the thing. It didn't move. He carefully spotted the position of his slitted eye. He began to whirl the kill club. It swooshed in the air. He put a heel to Windsplitter, and they raced straight at the thing. The kill club, carried with full speed of the running horse, whooshed down straight at the slitted eye. The crash of impact was deafening. Johnny slowed beyond the thing. It had not moved. He trotted Windsplitter back to the original position, 100 feet in front of the thing. He turned and made ready for a second run. The lead horse came up behind him to its habitual place. Johnny glanced at it and then back at the thing. He calculated the distance and the run to strike at the other slitted eye. He touched a heel. Windsplitter plunged forward, and then a great gout of yellow boomed from between the eyes. Johnny was struck with a blow like all the winds of High Peak rolled into one. Windsplitter caught the full force of it. Up into the air went horse and rider. Down they came, with a shuddering crash against the earth. Turl didn't know what he was looking at. He had bunked down in a car on the outskirts. He had the old Jinko map of the ancient city, but he had no curiosity about it. With a few shots of cabango, he had eased himself off to sleep, intending to be gone with the dawn. Through the city and into the mountains, senseless, even risky to go in the dark. The car, however, had grown hot with the morning sun before he awoke, and now he stared out at an odd thing in the street. Somewhere before him, maybe it had been the foothills that had awakened him. He didn't know what it was. He had seen horses. They were always falling down mine shafts, but he had never before seen a horse with two heads. That's right, two heads. One in the front and one in the middle. And a second animal of a similar sort behind. Only this one only had a second body in the middle, as if the second head was bent down out of sight. He batted his eye bones. He shifted over to the driver's seat and stared more intently through the armored windshield. The two beasts had now turned around and were walking the other way, so Turl started up and began to follow. It became apparent to him at once that the beast knew he was after them. He took a hasty look at the ancient street map, thinking he could flash around a couple of blocks and head them off. But instead it was the beasts who turned. Turl saw that they would dead end and knew they would circle a block. It was elementary, indeed, to handle this situation. He glanced again at his map and spotted the right buildings to make a barricade. The firepower of an old Mark II was not heavy, but it was surely enough for that. He adjusted the face lever with a fumbling, inexperienced paw and steered the tank into position. He hit the fire button. The resulting explosion was extremely satisfactory. The whole building tipped over to make a barricade. He jockeyed the throttle and wheeled around, went back down the street, turned, and sure enough, there they were. He had his quarry trapped. Then he sat with slack jawbones to see the beast go straight up and over the smoking rubble and vanish from view. Tyrrell sat there for a minute or two. Was this any part of what he was trying to accomplish? He was puzzled by the beast, but they didn't seem to have anything to do with the business he was in. Oh well, he had lots of time, and hunting was hunting after all. He pushed a button and fired off an antenna capsule set to hover 300 feet up and then turned on its picture screen. Sure enough, there were the beasts, tearing along, zigzagging around blocks. He watched the progress while he ate some breakfast. That done, he took a small shot of Cabango, engaged the drivetrain, and followed the picture, was soon following them into the open country, with his quarry plane in sight. He raced around in front and blocked them. They turned. He did it again. What were they? The second beast still had his head down, but the one in the lead definitely had two heads. Tyrrell decided he had better not talk about this to the recreation room. They'd roast him. He watched with curiosity when the beast in the front stopped, took his stick out of his belt, and began to run at him. His curiosity turned to amazement. The thing was going to attack him. Incredible! The crash of the club against the windshield was deafening. His earbuds rang with the assault, and that wasn't all. There was an immediate atmosphere sizzle. A wave of dizziness hit Tyrrell. Bright lights popped inside his skull. Air! Air was getting into the cab. This old Mark II had seen better days. The supposedly armoured windscreen had come loose in its mounts. Tyrrell gaped in disbelief. The side gasket had given way. He panicked, then his eye caught sight of the sign. The face masks must be worn at all times. And he hastily snatched the face mask and flask of breathe gas off the gunner seat and snapped it over his face. Opening the valve, he inhaled deeply, and the dizziness lessened. He took 3 deep breaths to clean the damned air out of his lungs. Tyrrell stared anew at the strange beast. It was lining up for another run. His paws fumbled at the firepower. He wanted the recoil of the blast following back through the open windscreen, and he knew that could be dangerous to him. Pulling the force lever low to aim and to stun, he hoped it was enough. The beast started the run. Tyrrell hit the fire button. It was enough, all right. The ions sizzled and glared. The beasts were slammed back, lifted clean off the ground. They fell. Tyrrell watched intently, just to make sure they were kept lying where they had fallen. Good, they did. He let out a shuddering sigh in his mask, winding down, and then he sat up straight. In new amazement, he had thought, when they were hit, that he was dealing with 2 four-legged beasts, but lying on the ground, they'd come apart. Tyrrell swung the side door wide open and crawled out. He checked his belt gun and then rumbled over to the game he had hit. 3 beasts, maybe 4. The 2 four-legged beasts were 2. One on the one behind, a bundle of something had fallen apart. That maybe made 3. The nearer one definitely was 2 different beasts. What a confusion! He shook his head, trying to clear it. The effects of air were not wearing off fast enough. Little bright sparks were still popping in front of his eyes. He lumbered over to a more distant one, pushing the tall grass away. It was a horse. He had seen plenty of horses. The plains were full of them, but this horse had a bundle tied to its back. Simple as that, the bundle would come loose. He kicked it. There wasn't anything alive, just some skins, some old animal hides, and nonsense bits of other things. He walked back toward the tank, through the high grasses. The other thing was also a horse, and over to the right, it had fallen clear. Tyrrell pushed back the grass. Well, luck of the gold nebula. It was a man. The cyclone turned back and turned the man over. What a small, puny body. Hair on the face and head, but nowhere else. 2 arms, 2 legs, white-brown skin. Tyrrell was unwilling to admit that Charles' description fitted. In fact, he resented the fact that he had come close and promptly rejected it. The chest was moving, only slightly, true, but it was still alive. Tyrrell felt fortunate indeed. His excursion was successful without even going up into the mountains. He picked the man up with one paw, went back to the tank, throwing the man into the gunner seat, which engulfed it. Then he set to work repairing the windscreen gasket with some permastick. The whole side of the glass had been dislodged, and although the glass itself was not even scratched, that had been quite a blow. He looked down at the small body swallowed in the seat. A fluke. It was the age of the tank, the brittleness of its gaskets. Sure, it was a ratty car. He'd find something wrong and put in Zip's records, misplaced parts or something else. He went over to the other gaskets, the doors, and the other screen. They seemed okay, if a little bit brittle. Well, he wasn't going underwater, and there was sure to be no more attacks from things like this. Tyrrell stood up on the driver's seat and looked around the horizon. All clear. No more of these beasts. He banged down on top and settled himself. His paw hit the compression change. The hiss of air exhausting from the cab and the gurgle of breathe gas entering was welcome. His face mask was sweaty in the glowing heat of the day, and he hated the thing. Oh, for a proper atmosphere planet, a planet with the right gravity, purple trees. The man-thing went into sudden convulsions. Tyrrell drew back alarmed. It was turning blue and jerking around. The last thing he wanted was a raving mad animal inside the cab. Hastily he adjusted his face mask, reversed compression, and kicked open the side door. With one bat of his paw he knocked the thing out into the grass. Tyrrell sat there watching it. He was afraid his plans were going to go up in a puff. The thing must have been more heavily affected by the stun blast than he knew. Crap, they were weak. He opened the cab top and looked over at one of the horses. He could see its sides moving. It was breathing, and wasn't any convulsions. It was even recovering. Well, a horse is a horse, and a man might be. He suddenly got it. The man thing couldn't breathe gas. The bluish colour was fading. The convulsions had stopped. The chest was panting, and the thing was gulping in big, great gulps of air. That gave Tyrrell a problem. Blast, he was going to ride back in the mine site in a face mask. He got out of the car, went to the farthest horse. It was recovering too. The sacks were lying near it, and Tyrrell rummaged through one and came up with some thongs. He went back and picked up the man-thing, slammed it on top of the car. He arranged it so his arms stuck out to each side. Tying piece after piece of thong together, he made a long rope. He tied one end to the wrist of the thing, passed under the ground car, grunting a bit as he lifted it up to do so, and tied the other to the other wrist. He yanked it good and tight. Then he pushed the man-thing experimentally to see whether it would fall off. Very good. He threw the sacks up onto the gunner seat and got in, closed up, and restarted the atmosphere change. The nearest horse was lifting its head, struggling to get up. Aside from surface blood boils caused by the stun gun, it seemed to be okay, which meant that the man-thing would probably recover as well. Tyrrell stretched his jawbones in a grin. Well, it was coming out all right after all. He started up the car, turned it, and headed back to the mine site.